Imagine a world where the human mind could be broken open like a safe. A world where a single pill, a few hours of interrogation, or the right psychological pressure could force a person to reveal everything they know. State secrets, military plans, the names of agents. In the early years of the Cold War, many American officials genuinely feared that such a technology might already exist, and even more alarming, that it might already be in the hands of their enemies. The early 1950s were filled with anxiety and uncertainty. World War II had ended only a few years earlier, but the peace that followed was fragile. The world was now divided between two powerful blocs, led by the United States and the Soviet Union. What followed was not a direct war between these superpowers, but a global struggle for influence, power, and technological superiority that would come to be known as the Cold War. Unlike previous conflicts, the Cold War was fought on many different fronts. It was fought through diplomacy, propaganda, espionage, economic competition, and scientific research. Both sides were racing to gain advantages wherever they could. Nuclear weapons, rocket technology, intelligence networks, every new development had the potential to shift the balance of power. But some American strategists began to believe that the next battlefield might not be in the sky or on land, but inside the human mind. If one nation could discover a way to control human thoughts, if it could force people to talk, obey, or even change their beliefs, that power would be more valuable than any bomb. An enemy agent could be turned into an informant, a captured spy could reveal every secret, and a loyal soldier might be transformed into a voice for the opposing ideology. These fears intensified during the Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953. During the conflict, thousands of American soldiers were captured by North Korean and Chinese forces. When the war ended and prisoners of war began returning home, something unusual happened. Several former American POWs made public statements criticizing the United States and its military actions. Some even spoke favorably about communist systems, and a small number refused to return home altogether. For many Americans, this behavior seemed almost impossible to explain. Soon, a new term began appearing in newspapers and political debates: brainwashing. The word described a process through which a person's beliefs could supposedly be broken down and replaced with entirely new ones through psychological pressure, isolation, sleep deprivation, and constant ideological messaging. Inside Washington, intelligence officials began to worry that the Soviet Union and China might be conducting secret experiments in psychology, neurology, and pharmacology. What if communist scientists had discovered ways to manipulate the human brain? What if they could chemically or psychologically force someone to reveal secrets or change their loyalties? For the CIA, these questions were not theoretical. They represented a potential threat to national security. By the early 1950s, the agency had already begun small studies on interrogation techniques and psychological warfare. But some officials believed a far larger effort was needed. At the center of these discussions was CIA Director Allen Dulles, who warned of a coming battle for men's minds. Convinced the United States could not afford to fall behind, Dulles approved a new secret research program on April 13, 1953. It was given a simple code name, MKUltra, after CIA Director Allen Dulles approved the creation of the new secret program. Preparations quietly began inside the agency for what would become one of the most unusual scientific projects of the Cold War. The CIA now faced a difficult task: finding scientists, doctors, and specialists who could help explore the limits of the human mind. The leaders of the program understood that such research would require not only significant funding, but also extreme secrecy. Even within the CIA itself, only a small number of officials knew about the true purpose of the project. The key figure chosen to lead this effort was a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb worked within the CIA's Technical Services Division, a department responsible for developing special tools and technologies for intelligence operations. Born in 1918 in New York to Jewish immigrant parents, Gottlieb had shown a strong interest in science from an early age. He later earned a doctorate in chemistry and became known for his expertise in biochemical substances. Despite a physical disability that left him with a lifelong limp, Gottlieb was known among colleagues for his determination, intense curiosity, and unconventional thinking. By the early 1950s, he had already become an important figure inside the CIA's scientific programs. When the MKUltra project was approved, Gottlieb was placed in charge of its research efforts. His division was given the mission of exploring any possible method that could influence or manipulate the human mind. To accomplish this, the CIA began secretly funding dozens of scientific studies. Some were conducted in universities, others in hospitals and research institutes. In many cases, the scientists involved had no idea that their funding came from the CIA. The money was often funneled through private foundations and research grants designed to hide the true source of the program. One of the first areas that captured Gottlieb's attention was the study of psychoactive substances. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, researchers around the world had begun examining a relatively new chemical compound known as LSD. The substance had been first synthesized in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, but its powerful psychological effects were discovered only years later. LSD could dramatically alter perception, produce vivid hallucinations, and trigger intense emotional experiences. To some scientists, it appeared to offer a unique window into the workings of the human mind. For Sidney Gottlieb, LSD seemed to offer something even more intriguing. He believed that the drug might weaken the psychological defenses of the human brain, making a person more vulnerable to suggestion or interrogation. If that assumption proved correct, LSD could potentially become a powerful tool for intelligence operations. The CIA quickly began acquiring supplies of LSD for its experiments. According to later reports, the agency even purchased large portions of the world's available stock of the drug in order to keep it out of the hands of other governments. Inside CIA laboratories, scientists began conducting experiments to study how the substance affected memory, perception, emotional stability, and resistance to questioning. But the research soon expanded beyond the laboratory environment. CIA scientists and intelligence officers began testing the drug on human subjects. In some cases, the participants were volunteers who agreed to take part in scientific studies. However, in other situations, individuals had no idea they were part of an experiment connected to a secret government program. Early tests were carried out on small groups of volunteers, including students, military personnel, and government employees. Researchers administered various doses of LSD and carefully observed how subjects reacted. They recorded changes in speech, emotional responses, attention levels, and reactions to stress. The goal was to determine whether psychoactive substances could be used to influence behavior or weaken psychological resistance. However, it did not take long for the experiments to grow more ambitious and more dangerous. Some CIA researchers began asking a troubling question. What would happen if a person took LSD without knowing it? Would their reactions be more genuine? Would they lose control more easily if they were unaware of what was happening to them? The search for answers to these questions would push the MKUltra program into one of the most controversial phases of its history, as experiments began moving out of controlled laboratory settings and into real-world environments, sometimes without the knowledge of the people who had unknowingly become test subjects. Soon the experiments conducted under the MKUltra program began to move far beyond the secure laboratories of the CIA. Sidney Gottlieb and his team increasingly believed that in order to obtain meaningful results, they needed to observe how people reacted in real-life situations, not only in carefully controlled scientific environments. Because of this, researchers began searching for new ways to test psychoactive substances on individuals who had no idea they were part of an experiment. In the view of some officials involved in the program, only this approach could reveal the true and unfiltered reaction of the human mind to unexpected exposure to powerful drugs. One of the earliest steps was to conduct experiments within the intelligence community itself. CIA employees were sometimes given LSD without warning, so researchers could observe their behavior under its influence. The goal was to determine whether a person could still function, make decisions, or maintain emotional control while unknowingly affected by a powerful psychoactive substance. However, the results were often unpredictable. Some participants experienced intense anxiety, confusion, and severe disorientation. Others reacted with panic or paranoia, making it clear that the drug could produce extremely unstable psychological effects. As the program expanded, the experiments began to involve other groups as well. University students, psychiatric patients, and even prison inmates became subjects in various studies. In some cases, participants were told they were taking part in scientific research related to memory or human behavior. In many other cases, however, the true nature of the experiments remained hidden. People participated in studies without understanding that their reactions to drugs and psychological stress were being carefully monitored and recorded by intelligence officials. The CIA also collaborated with universities and medical institutions, providing funding through private foundations and research grants designed to conceal the agency's involvement. Within these projects, researchers explored many different methods that might influence human consciousness. They studied how individuals reacted to prolonged isolation, sleep deprivation, and extreme psychological pressure. Some experiments involved the use of electroshock therapy to intensify psychological effects. At the same time, LSD remained one of the most mysterious and controversial elements of the research. Scientists observed that the drug could trigger powerful hallucinations and dramatically alter a person's perception of reality. People under its influence sometimes lost their sense of time and identity, or experienced intense emotional reactions. For the researchers behind MKUltra, these effects seemed to offer a possible pathway to manipulating human consciousness. Yet the results were wildly inconsistent. Some subjects experienced euphoria and calm, while others felt overwhelming fear and panic. Despite the uncertainty, the search for answers continued, and within the program, a new idea began to take shape. If these experiments were moved even further outside the laboratory, researchers might observe human behavior in its most natural form. That idea would soon lead to one of the most controversial operations of the entire project, an operation later known as Operation Midnight Climax. By the mid-1950s, the MKUltra program had entered a new and far more controversial phase. Researchers within the CIA, led by Sidney Gottlieb, had become convinced that laboratory experiments alone were not enough to understand how psychoactive drugs affected human behavior. If they truly wanted to study how people reacted under the influence of substances like LSD, they needed to observe them in natural, everyday situations. The challenge, however, was obvious. In a normal scientific study, participants usually knew they were part of an experiment. That awareness could change how they behaved. To some officials inside the CIA, the only way to observe genuine reactions was to test people without their knowledge. Out of this idea emerged one of the most unusual operations ever conducted by the agency. The project was given the name Operation Midnight Climax. Beginning in the mid-1950s, the CIA secretly rented apartments in several American cities, including San Francisco and New York. From the outside, these apartments appeared completely ordinary. Inside, however, they were carefully prepared for surveillance. The rooms were equipped with hidden microphones, recording devices, and one-way mirrors that allowed observers to watch everything happening inside without being seen. To carry out the operation, the CIA recruited women who worked as prostitutes. Their role was to bring clients back to the safe houses without raising suspicion. Once inside the apartment, the unsuspecting men were offered drinks that had been secretly mixed with LSD. After the drug began to take effect, CIA agents observed their behavior from behind the hidden mirrors. They recorded conversations, emotional reactions, and any unusual psychological responses. For the researchers involved in MKUltra, these strange experiments were supposed to reveal how powerful substances affected human behavior in unpredictable social situations. They wanted to know whether a person under the influence of LSD might reveal secrets, lose emotional control, or become more susceptible to suggestion. However, the operation was conducted with almost no ethical oversight. Many of the people involved had no idea they were part of a government experiment. Some CIA officers even treated the operation casually, sometimes drinking alcohol while observing the subjects from behind the mirrors. What had begun as a scientific investigation into the human mind was slowly turning into something far darker and more controversial than anyone outside the program could have imagined. While operations like Midnight Climax were unfolding in secret apartments, the MKUltra program continued to expand across the United States. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the CIA had quietly funded dozens of research projects in universities, hospitals, prisons, and psychiatric institutions. Many of these studies were connected to what were known as MKUltra sub-projects, each focusing on different methods of influencing human behavior. Some researchers studied the effects of drugs, while others explored hypnosis, sensory deprivation, or extreme psychological stress. In total, the program would eventually include more than 150 separate sub-projects, making it one of the largest and most complex behavioral research efforts ever secretly sponsored by a government agency. One of the most disturbing areas of experimentation involved sensory deprivation. Scientists discovered that when people were isolated from normal sensory input, such as light, sound, and physical movement, their minds could begin to behave in unexpected ways. Some subjects placed in isolation tanks reported hallucinations or confusion after only a few hours. Others became extremely vulnerable to suggestion. For MKUltra researchers, this discovery appeared to support the theory that breaking down a person's normal perception of reality might make them easier to influence or control. Another technique that attracted attention was electroconvulsive therapy, more commonly known as electroshock treatment. In certain experiments, extremely high levels of electrical stimulation were applied to patients in an attempt to disrupt memory and personality patterns. Some researchers believed that if existing memories could be erased or weakened, new beliefs or behaviors might be introduced in their place. These ideas reflected a growing belief within parts of the intelligence community that the human personality could potentially be dismantled and rebuilt. Many of the individuals who participated in these experiments had no idea that the CIA was involved. Some were told they were taking part in legitimate medical research. Others were psychiatric patients who trusted doctors overseeing their treatment. The lack of informed consent would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the MKUltra program. But at the time, inside the secret world of Cold War intelligence, many officials believed that the potential benefits of discovering a reliable method of mind control outweighed the ethical concerns. Despite the enormous amount of money and effort invested in these experiments, the results were often confusing and inconsistent. Human psychology proved far more complicated than researchers had expected. Different people reacted to drugs, stress, and isolation in completely different ways. What worked on one subject might fail completely on another. Yet instead of slowing down the research, these uncertainties often pushed the program further. Within the CIA, some officials believed they were still only beginning to understand the true possibilities of manipulating the human mind. By the early 1960s, the MKUltra program had grown into a vast and highly secret network of experiments spread across the United States and even beyond its borders. What had originally begun as a research project focused on interrogation and psychological influence had slowly evolved into something far more complex. CIA scientists, university researchers, psychiatrists, and medical professionals were all involved in different parts of the program, often without knowing the full scope of what they were contributing to. Many believed they were participating in legitimate academic studies funded through research grants, unaware that the ultimate sponsor behind much of the work was the Central Intelligence Agency. Among the most controversial experiments conducted during this period were those led by psychiatrist Dr. Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, Canada. Cameron was a respected psychiatrist and at one time even served as the president of the American Psychiatric Association. Through funding that secretly originated from the CIA, Cameron conducted a series of highly experimental treatments on psychiatric patients. His approach, which he called psychic driving, aimed to erase existing patterns of thought and rebuild the personality from scratch. To achieve this, patients were subjected to extreme treatments. Many received powerful combinations of drugs, extended periods of drug-induced sleep, and repeated electroshock therapy at levels far beyond typical medical use. Some patients were kept unconscious for days or even weeks, while recordings of repeated messages were played to them continuously. Cameron believed that by breaking down a person's existing mental patterns, it might be possible to implant new ones in their place. While he considered this a form of advanced psychiatric research, many patients later reported severe memory loss, confusion, and long-term psychological damage. For the CIA, experiments like Cameron's were seen as potential breakthroughs. If the human mind could be erased and rebuilt, it might open the door to new forms of interrogation, psychological warfare, or even the creation of individuals who could be programmed to carry out specific tasks. Yet even within the intelligence community, some officials began to question whether the program was moving into dangerous territory. The line between scientific research and unethical human experimentation was becoming increasingly blurred. Despite these concerns, MKUltra continued for years, fueled by the ongoing pressure of the Cold War. The fear that rival nations might be developing similar or even more advanced techniques kept the program alive. Within the secret world of intelligence operations, the possibility of controlling the human mind remained too powerful and too tempting for many officials to abandon. As the 1960s progressed, the MKUltra program continued to operate largely in the shadows, known only to a small group of officials within the CIA and a handful of researchers connected to its many sub-projects. By this time, the program had already been running for nearly a decade. During those years, the agency had spent millions of dollars funding experiments on drugs, hypnosis, behavioral conditioning, and psychological manipulation. Yet despite the scale of the research, the results were often unclear. The human mind proved far more complex and unpredictable than many scientists had originally believed. Inside the CIA, opinions about the program were beginning to shift. Some officials remained convinced that the research could eventually produce a reliable method of influencing human behavior. Others, however, began to doubt that true mind control was even possible. Experiments with LSD and other drugs produced wildly different reactions from one person to another. While some subjects became more talkative or emotionally open, others experienced intense fear, paranoia, or psychological breakdowns. Instead of creating obedient subjects, the substances often produced chaos and unpredictability. At the same time, the political climate in the United States was changing. The 1960s were a period of growing public skepticism toward government institutions. The Vietnam War, civil rights protests, and social unrest were already placing enormous pressure on American political leaders. In this atmosphere, the possibility that secret government programs were conducting experiments on unsuspecting citizens was something that officials desperately wanted to keep hidden. Within the CIA itself, there was increasing concern that if the full details of MKUltra ever became public, the consequences could be severe. The program involved hundreds of experiments, many conducted without the informed consent of the participants. Some researchers had used powerful drugs on patients who believed they were receiving normal medical treatment. Others had conducted psychological experiments on prisoners, students, and hospital patients, who had little understanding of what was actually happening to them. By the late 1960s, parts of the MKUltra program were beginning to slow down. Some of its sub-projects were quietly discontinued, while others were absorbed into different research initiatives within the intelligence community. However, the program itself remained classified, and very few people outside the agency had any idea that it had ever existed. But this secrecy would not last forever. In the early 1970s, A series of political scandals and investigations would begin to expose hidden activities within the U.S. government. And once investigators started looking into the secret world of intelligence operations, the story of MKUltra would slowly begin to surface. In the early 1970s, the political climate in the United States began to change dramatically. Public trust in government institutions was weakening, especially after a series of major political scandals. The most significant of these was the Watergate scandal, which erupted in 1972 and eventually led to the resignation of President Richard Nixon in 1974. As journalists and investigators uncovered illegal activities connected to the Nixon administration, attention also began to turn toward the secret operations of intelligence agencies. During this period, Congress launched several investigations aimed at examining the activities of U.S. intelligence organizations, including the CIA, the FBI, and the National Security Agency. Many members of Congress believed that these agencies had operated for too long without proper oversight. Reports began to surface suggesting that intelligence organizations had conducted surveillance on American citizens, infiltrated political groups, and carried out secret experiments. Inside the CIA, these investigations caused serious concern. Senior officials feared that if Congress began examining past programs too closely, some of the agency's most controversial activities might be exposed. One of the programs that worried them the most was MKUltra. The experiments conducted under this project had involved drugs, psychological manipulation, and human subjects who were often unaware they were participating in research. In 1973, CIA Director Richard Helms made a decision that would have lasting consequences for the historical record of the program. Shortly before leaving his position, Helms ordered the destruction of many MKUltra documents. Thousands of files related to the program were reportedly shredded or otherwise eliminated. The goal was simple. If the records no longer existed, it would be much harder for investigators to uncover the full scope of what had happened. Despite this effort to erase the evidence, not all documents were destroyed. Some records survived by accident, stored in financial archives, and other administrative files that had not been included in the destruction order. At the time, few people realized that these surviving documents would later become the key pieces of evidence that allowed investigators to reconstruct the story of MKUltra. Meanwhile, pressure for transparency continued to grow. Journalists, activists, and members of Congress demanded answers about the activities of intelligence agencies. The American public was beginning to question whether secret government programs had gone too far. Within this atmosphere of growing scrutiny, the hidden history of MKUltra was slowly moving closer to being revealed. What had remained one of the CIA's most closely guarded secrets for 2 decades was about to face its first real investigation. By the mid-1970s, the secret world surrounding the MKUltra program was finally beginning to unravel. In 1975, the United States Senate launched a major investigation into the activities of American intelligence agencies. The investigation became known as the Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church, who led the inquiry. For the first time, government officials were required to testify about covert programs that had operated in secrecy for decades. Among the many revelations that emerged during the hearings was the existence of the MKUltra project. Although many documents had already been destroyed on orders from CIA Director Richard Helms, the surviving records were enough to paint a disturbing picture. Investigators discovered that the CIA had funded more than 150 separate sub-projects connected to MKUltra. These experiments had taken place in universities, hospitals, prisons, and research laboratories across the United States and Canada. Some involved drugs, such as LSD, while others focused on hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock treatments, and psychological manipulation. In many cases, the people involved in these studies had never been informed that they were participating in experiments connected to a secret government program. When the details became public, the reaction was immediate and intense. Many Americans were shocked to learn that their own government had conducted experiments on human subjects without consent. Questions about ethics, responsibility, and oversight quickly followed. Some victims and their families sought compensation, while civil rights groups demanded stronger protections against unethical research. The revelations forced both the government and the intelligence community to confront the consequences of operating powerful secret programs without adequate supervision. In the years that followed, new rules were introduced to regulate experiments involving human subjects, particularly in government-funded research. Intelligence agencies were placed under greater congressional oversight, and ethical standards for scientific research were strengthened. Yet even with these reforms, many questions about MKUltra remain unanswered. Because so many records were destroyed, historians still cannot fully reconstruct everything that happened inside the program. Today, MKUltra is remembered as one of the most controversial chapters of the Cold War. What began as a desperate attempt to understand the limits of human psychology eventually turned into a program that crossed ethical boundaries and raised profound questions about the power of governments and the vulnerability of individuals. It serves as a reminder of how fear and competition during the Cold War pushed nations to explore methods that might once have seemed unthinkable. And even decades later, the story still raises an unsettling question. Can the human mind truly be controlled? Or was the search for mind control itself one of the greatest illusions of the Cold War? If you found this story interesting and want to learn more about hidden history and secret operations from the past, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for the next episode.